Thank you, Scott. I'm just checking a date. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, Crystal City, if you're going to be in San Francisco on March 9th, it'll be shown there. And if you're lucky enough to be at Mardi Gras in Sydney, Australia, later, I think next week, it'll be there too. I won't, but it will be. So anyway, thanks. Um, Tonight, it's a little different. I do a group on chemsex and a site called In the Rooms. And Dr. Rob also does one on sex addiction on Mondays. I do mine on, I'm not sure what day his is. Mine is on Tuesday evenings. But we had a question last night, and it got me to thinking, and I thought it might be an interesting topic for this webinar tonight. It was a question posed by someone who had 7 years of recovery from drugs. It was a woman who was expressing some loneliness and had met somebody she really liked, but that person was not an addict, but the person regularly smoked marijuana and drinks alcohol. And it was like, her question was, what do I do with that? Is that okay for me in my life? How does that look? What does that mean? And it got me to thinking about things. So I want to share a little bit of my own experience, and then I came up with some maybe guidelines for something like that, on like a decision-making process for that. But first of all, let me just say, for most addicts in recovery, I think that's a really tricky situation and maybe a no-brainer. Certainly in early recovery, I really had to purge anybody in my life who was certainly in active addiction, but I couldn't really be around anybody who was drinking at all. And I was a real hardliner about that for many years. And that was a way of protecting myself, and it worked. But eventually, I thought about expanding my universe, because all my friends were in program, and that's fine. But I was interested in maybe having other kinds of people in there. And I was with a partner who liked to cook, and wanted to cook with wine in the house, and what do we do with that, and that kind of thing. And so going out to dinner, if we were going out with another couple, did they have a glass of wine or a beer? What about that? And so these problems do arise because we can't live in a total 12-step vacuum. And but it's really kind of a tricky situation, I think, for a lot of people. It was for me. As I say, I didn't have alcohol in my house for many years. I do have wine now, cooking wine in my refrigerator, and it doesn't bother me. But I have many decades of sobriety. So anyway, it's got me to thinking what to tell her. And so a couple of things I came up with. One is just really know yourself and be really well grounded in your recovery. And as I said, for many years, I didn't entertain that option at all until I started, often through friends, being in a situation where somebody might have a beer who's not an addict, they're not in relapse. And when I did do that, or I entertained that many years after my own recovery, I found it didn't really bother me. Now, if people get sloppy drunk, and alcohol is one thing. I can't be around drugs in any way, shape, or form. But, and if people are drinking too much, that I just don't have anything, any tolerance for that either, because people are nearly not as entertaining as they think they are when they're drinking. I don't find it really amusing. But if somebody's having a glass of wine or something at dinner, that doesn't bother me, for me. And I think this is a really highly individualized choice. But my point here is that I had to be really grounded, I think, in my recovery and my comfort zone and my willingness to put up boundaries and understand those boundaries. And for me, as I mentioned, my own journey in this, my boundaries changed from not being around it at all to sort of being okay if somebody at a table was having their own thing. So that was one thing. The next was to be aware of my intentions when I'm thinking about this. Okay, so I was not a bar drinker at the end. I was just like lonely at-home drinker, sad. Oh, I could tell you such a story, but I was not a bar drinker. So over the years, occasionally I thought, well, I wasn't a bar drinker. Bars don't represent a risk for me. Why couldn't I go to bars? And I've never really been interested in hanging out in bars, but sometimes people want to meet at a bar or something. But I realized I really have to be aware of my intentions, because my rationale, and addicts are really good at rationalizing, is that, well, I wasn't a bar drinker, but I think that could really still be a very dangerous place for me. So I choose, I mean, I've been in bars, I've walked through bars maybe. I don't hang out in bars by any means. You know, if I'm in a city in Europe or something, and my partner and I walk through a bar, but I don't hang out there. But I think I really have to be aware of my intentions. It reminds me of meth clients I've had who decided they would keep a little meth in the house just to prove to themselves they didn't take it. They wouldn't have to take it. That's a really bad strategy. So I think just to be aware of my intentions, to really be aware of my triggers and cues in the situation. And I'm not, no addict is like a steady state all the time, right? So normally I'm in good shape, but if I'm in a place where I'm feeling vulnerable or upset about something, or not myself, then I think I need to sort of shift those boundaries back to a tighter circle around me, so that I may not want to go out to somebody, having dinner with somebody who's drinking, if I'm not in a good place. And so to really kind of be aware of where I'm at and my own triggers and cues. And I remember a relative of mine who's in recovery also for a long time, was talking about some of his specific triggers, and with cooking wine, which he does not do. And he doesn't do it because the smell, and this, just the smell of wine, even though he's many years in recovery too, it's triggering for him. So I think to really understand what's triggering for me, what's triggering for any of us, and remembering people, places, things, senses, you know, sights, smells, the visuals of stuff, all those can be triggering. And even though you can have a lot of recovery under your belt, I think it's still, those things can come alive really fast. And again, depending on kind of our emotional space. And I found two things that are, I really have to be careful of, are smells, which are really old and powerful sense. That's our oldest sense of sensory input, and emotions. You know, if I'm, and there are certain emotions, if I'm feeling those, I really have to kind of be careful with myself. So that need to set healthy boundaries is really important, and to always remember I have the right to do it. And that was something I was really aware of early on in my recovery, is that, you know, I had the right to, if I was uncomfortable, to get up and go, to leave, to say, no, that does make me uncomfortable, and not to be polite if it really was making me uncomfortable, to say it. So I think having those boundaries is really important. The other thing I thought of is remembering that time really doesn't reduce our addiction. You know, there's a lot of slogans in program where, you know, our disease is sitting there with us, learning all these things we're learning in recovery, and it's right there under the surface. And I don't want to fool myself that I have a lot of time in recovery and think that I could maybe handle something that I really shouldn't be trying to handle. And understanding that we can really rationalize all kinds of crazy actions, like me not being a bar drinker, making it okay to hang out in bars, or the meth user who keeps some meth at home just to prove that he won't use it. And finally, probably the most important thing I realized, and this is what I told this person last night, is to really just consult with everybody, talk to everybody, talk to your sponsor, talk to your friends, check it out with your own gut, but to really get feedback, because I think there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and lived experience in the rooms and the people around us who can give us straight advice, you know. And I think this is somewhat akin in sexual recovery, sex addiction recovery. There's the boundary plan, right? And there's that middle boundary. Like, what do we do with some of that stuff? For some people, those behaviors are in the inner circle, meaning they're behaviors that represent basically being in the disease. There are others that are kind of slippery slope areas. And I think some of these situations may fall into that middle boundary, although we don't actively use that in drug recovery. But I think the best thing to do always is not to act independently and make that decision about myself, but tell everybody and get feedback and input. So it just, the question I found is so poignant with 7 years of recovery, to be wondering about this and thinking about this, and, you know, how long do we have to kind of live with these guidelines? And there's no clear answer, but I found that I think there are some helpful things to just know our intentions, to know where we're at emotionally, to seek guidance, and to put it out there. So that's kind of that. Scott, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. I have, you know, like you, most of my friends are in recovery, but I have several normie friends, and They like to have a cocktail. Sometimes they have two cocktails. You know, there's one particular couple that I go out to dinner with fairly often, and I just know that I'm going to drive, and they're going to appreciate the fact that I'm driving. They don't get obnoxious. You know, they have a cocktail or two. They get a little loose. You know, it's fine. I have another couple. One of them and I are about the same age, and we have the same musical taste. The other one does not like the music. So the one, we go to concerts together, and he likes to smoke pot before concerts, you know, which I used to like to do. And I find that it doesn't bother me at all if they have edibles in California now. It's legal, you know, you just eat a piece of candy. So it really doesn't bother me. But, you know, I can watch a concert on TV at home and I want to get high. That's a trigger. And David hit it, you know, because I'm lonely, I'm bored, you know, if I'm out with a friend or friends, it can be really fun. And if, you know, but it can also not be fun. So I have to be really aware of my triggers. And I love that you mentioned smells as triggers, especially for alcoholics. You know, you waft some scotch in front of you just say scotch and I can smell it. So yeah, I don't keep alcohol in the house. You know, I have recovering meth addict friends who keep meth in the house for their tricks, and I think that's a terrible idea. But and they inevitably relapse. They're not close friends, but you know, people I know, and they're like, oh well, it wasn't for me. I'm like, yeah, well, you know, it's just a bad idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, knowing your motivation, talking to your support network in recovery. Yeah. So I just want to remind everybody, ask questions using the Q&A feature. We've got a couple questions in already. We got a good crowd tonight, so get your questions in early and often. So let's just skip to some questions here. Here's number one. Hello, I am brand new to Seeking Integrity. Welcome. I'm looking at this at the request of my wife. She thinks I'm a sex addict because of 3 items. Number one, I have asked that she come to bed in her bra and underwear rather than her religious garments. She's Mormon and I used to be. 2, I have asked that she cuddle naked after intercourse. Mormons are supposed to put their religious clothing on at all times other than sex and swimming. 3, I masturbate when I travel without the use of pornography. I do not feel that I'm a sex addict, but I'm very new to this concept and open to the fact that I might be. When I was a Mormon, I did not ask for or participate in the activities above. David?
Wow. Yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky question because we get into some guidelines that are religious based. And first of all, welcome too. I'm glad you're here. You know, when we look at sex addiction, the definition of addiction is really certain kind of behaviors that over which we start to lose control. They become compulsive. They make our lives unmanageable. We kind of lose control over them. We start to rationalize. We compartmentalize those behaviors. They become secretive. It can lead to a whole other life that we start doing those behaviors at the expense of things we should be doing, like our job or taking care of our kids or whatever it may be. So there's some specific definitions of addiction. I'm not sure all these fall into that criteria explicitly. Even masturbation, men do masturbate. Without porn is fine. I guess a sex addict would masturbate to the point where it's interfering with his life and causing problems and not having him do what he's supposed to be doing. So these almost become more questions of preference and style and religious beliefs and subtleties. And, you know, I'm not sure it's necessarily a sex addiction. I do think it's something that would benefit from some couples counseling with communication and preferences. And I'm not a Mormon. I don't understand all the requirements and the beliefs necessarily. But it sounds like you guys are just on different pages sexually. A lot of the stuff that you're asking about from your wife outside of that religious context would not be considered necessarily unusual. And so I guess I would seek guidance from, I don't know if elders would be the appropriate people, or a professional that could guide you. I think what I would do as a therapist in this case would really to look at some communication guidelines and what you want, how you can meet each other's needs, and still have respect for your beliefs and preferences somehow, if there's some middle ground or compromise there. So I guess I would get some outside guidance on those issues. I don't, if we were to take the Mormon piece out of this question, I don't necessarily think a lot of that is sex addictive behavior. But sometimes those things are subjective too. So, I don't know, Scott, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, actually. You know, the basic way that we define, I'll give you the Dr. Rob answer here, that we define sex addiction using 3 criteria. Preoccupation to the point of obsession, loss of control, which means you've tried and failed to either quit or cut back, usually repeatedly, and negative consequences, everything from relationship trouble to shame to depression to trouble at work or in school, you know, all kinds of things, both internal and external can qualify as consequences. What you're describing here, you know, the consequences, you know, you and your wife are not on the same page. You know, in my experience, there's often more to the story than we get in our questions. So, you know, I don't want to read more into this. You know, I'll take you at your word here. So what you're describing, I agree with David, does not sound like sex addiction. The other thought, and I again agree with David that the two of you are not on the same page with this stuff. And I would suggest, you know, a counselor. You know, you may feel more comfortable with a counselor than a church elder since you're formerly Mormon. I would suggest on Tuesday mornings, Jonathan Taylor, he hosts a webinar. It's the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of every month. So I think the next one will be like the 25th. He's in Salt Lake City. He has a lot of Mormon clients. He deals with stuff like this and he answers questions. He can probably give you a much better answer than David or I can, because he'll have some conceptual, you know, some context to throw into this. So yeah, but you know, I would, you know, look at your behavior. Are you preoccupied to the point of obsession? You know, have you lost control? Have you tried to quit and failed? And are you having consequences? If you don't meet those conditions, you're not a sex addict. The other thing I did want to add is there are some religious-based and morals-based therapists out there who will tell you that you are a sex addict, even though you don't qualify as sex addicted. Because they apply their own values to what they think is acceptable sexual behavior, and anything that isn't must be sex addiction. Otherwise, why would you be doing it? You know, and I am not a big believer in that. You know, I think it's shaming, and you know, therapists are supposed to help you, not enforce their beliefs on you. So if you're going to get a therapist or work with a therapist, get somebody who understands sex addiction first and foremost. So yeah, that was long-winded, but
yeah, that's helpful.
Next question, are there inner and outer circles for eating disorders? Are there triggers for eating disorders as well? Let me just explain inner outer circles. In sex addiction recovery, we do what we call a sobriety plan, and we work with our clients, or I work with my sponsees, we work with our clients at Seeking Integrity. That we create what we call a circle plan. The inner circle is bottom line problem behaviors, you know, looking at porn, anything illegal, cheating on my wife, you know, the things that are, you know, if I do these things, I am not sexually sober. The outer circle is really healthy behaviors, things that I'm going to do instead of my addiction, you know, paint the house, go back to school, read a book, you know, talk to friends, hang out with the kids. And then there's a middle circle in between those, which is kind of slippery areas. if I'm bored, if I get in an argument, if I drive through a certain part of town, things like that. So that's the inner and outer circle that we're being asked about that. So David, are there inner and outer circle for eating disorders, and are there triggers for eating disorders as well? That's the question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think, yes, I mean, absolutely. And one of the things about eating disorders is that it really, like all the process addictions, there's some flexibility in terms of what sobriety is. So you might have someone who doesn't eat refined carbohydrates. So you might have someone who is trying to not purge, or there's all kinds of things. So I think that inner circle, which means the equivalent of the behaviors, that means you're in your addiction, not sober, in whatever terms those are, may vary for different people. So it may be eating sugar, it may be binging, it may be purging, it may be eating certain kinds of foods, or eating more than a certain allotment, depending on whatever food plan you may be following. And I think there would be middle circles. Some of those sort of slippery slope behaviors might be, weighing yourself excessively every day, or I can't even think of some good ones.
Wandering through the ice cream aisle.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Wandering through the ice cream aisle, or fantasizing about food. Looking at food too much. I worked with some anorexics who were totally food obsessed. They would cook for everybody else all day long, but they wouldn't eat themselves. So really being in that food obsessed state, even though you're feeding someone else, might be an inner or a middle. So I think, yeah, depending on the kind of abstinence you formulated, what your program looks like, I think it's definitely a useful model to use. And then the outer circle, of course, are the healthy behaviors that are reinforcing your recovery, and those can be kind of universal and would apply to not just sex addiction or drugs, but for eating disorders as well. So I think depending on how you look at your abstinence and the behaviors that are involved, where the preoccupation can be, or what it is that you're trying to control, because and the boundary plan is really useful for eating disorders, which is a process addiction, right? Process addictions are these behavioral addictions where we can't just give it up. I'm an alcoholic. I can give up alcohol and never look at it again. But I can't give up sex if I'm a sex addict, or I can't give up food if I'm a food addict, because we have to learn how to integrate those things back into our lives in a healthy way. And so I think it's definitely useful to kind of use that three-part approach to see what those behaviors are, and then what are the kind of slippery slope behaviors that would be useful for you.
Yeah, David makes a really good point there about sobriety. Alcohol and drug sobriety, it's abstinence. Boom, done, end of discussion. The Circle Plan was created, I think initially by Patrick Carnes, to help sex addicts, because sexual sobriety it looks different for every person. None of us want to never have sex again. The goal is to learn how to be sexual in ways that are healthy for us. And I'm a single gay man. My sexual sobriety is probably going to look a lot different than my friend who's married to a woman with 3 kids. I mean, there are things that I can do that he can't, and there are things that he can probably do that I can't. So it's going to, and eating disorders are the same way. As David said, it's just going to look different for everybody. So I think the Circle Plan is great. I actually use the Circle Plan with my AA and drug addict sponsees as well, just because it gives such clarity to, this is the stuff that's really problematic, this is the stuff that's slippery, and this is the stuff that I can do to have a healthy, enjoyable life.
Right.
And I think that's so important. So,
Great.
Are the triggers for eating disorders pretty similar to alcoholism, sex addiction, etc., like loneliness, boredom, depression, etc.? Also, inner and outer circles, kind of similar to, yeah, we just kind of talked about that. I go to OA and I hear a lot of similarities between my addiction and others, but I guess if I fail to see the differences and don't get help for that in particular, then I probably won't really get the help I need. So are the triggers the same, and are the addictions the same, and what are the differences that people should look for?
So, I mean, definitely all addictions really stem from kind of poorly constructed ways to deal with feelings and emotions typically that we don't want to be feeling or aware of. And so the things you described, loneliness, boredom, depression, and so on, are universal uncomfortable feelings. And depending on what kind of addicts we are, we may deal with those feelings, or more accurately, not deal with those feelings by acting out some way addictively. And that could be with food, it can be with gambling, it could be with drugs, it could be with sex or porn, or some combination of all those things. So yeah, I mean, the triggers are definitely the same. The emotional triggers, how they manifest, I think, is unique to each individual. So maybe, you know, the people, places, and things, and how those addictions have woven themselves into our lives and have manifested kind of unique cues and triggers that we need to kind of deconstruct and be aware of in our lives. So definitely, I think all addictions are about dealing, or really kind of escaping from, numbing, dissociating from uncomfortable feelings like the ones you describe. And almost all addictions really are rooted in trauma, for sure. And so that's where a lot of those feelings come from in the first place. So I think there's a great universality. And one of the things I was speaking with our clients earlier today is about the great potential for addiction to play kind of whack-a-mole if we don't deal with all of it, because all of these are ways to deal with, you know, loneliness or feeling low self-worth or depression, the kind of things we just named. And if I'm drinking myself to death to deal with those, and I get sober, unless I deal with those feelings and learn how to deal with them in a healthy way, I'm just going to transfer addictions. I may start overeating, or you know, take out my credit cards and go shopping, or start looking at porn, or, you know, it's the same stuff. It's numbing those things. So unless we really deal with the root causes, the different expressions of addiction are kind of symptoms that we get so easy to transfer. If you look around the rooms, whatever 12-step fellowship you're in, I guarantee you'll see people that have just really transferred one to the other without really addressing those issues.
I do think it's important, though, to go to the 12-step meeting that deals with your particular addiction or whatever you're struggling with on that day. I mean, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a drug addict, I'm a sex addict, and I go to all three meetings because I need people to speak the language of my particular addiction. You know, I need to hear that. I could go to an OA meeting and get a lot from it, but not as much as I can get from one of my meetings, because they're talking about food and it's not really my language. So I do think that's where the differences come in. They're just little nuances that people will get in the right room.
Right, and that's a really important point. I just want to underline what Scott just said, because I think it's the nature of addicts to walk into a room and quickly identify how we're different from all these people. You know, it's well, I'm not like him, I'm like him. And it's particularly true with sex addicts. So you may see someone who uses porn and you don't, or someone who's arrested and you never were. And, you know, it's easy to compare. Or someone who's, I was partners with a food addict for a long time. And, you know, he would kind of compare himself to anorexics, which he was not. He was a bulimorexic. And, just, you know, but the thing with addiction, we have to sort of see what we have in common, you know, where are the similarities. But I do agree that it's important to go to a fellowship that reflects and speaks the language that you identify with, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, this one's coming from our treatment center residents in LA. Hi, guys. I want to know, is it possible for someone who has committed child sexual abuse to become a healthy, safe member of society, safe to be around children, safe to have their own children? What might such a healing process look like? Very good question.
Great question. And, you know, I would say yes. I mean, there's always that hope and that recovery there. You know, I think a lot of times people kind of fall into that, sometimes with porn, sometimes an escalation of behaviors, some of the stimulation where the need for more, and then it kind of drifts over into other things. And that's an unfortunate situation that's harmful for everyone in that case. But yeah, absolutely. People need to work their program, understand their own issues, and often have to live with consequences from those behaviors too, that are lifelong and really difficult to deal with. So yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think many people have gotten into recovery and are totally safe to be around children, to have their own children, to love their own children, and respect those boundaries. I mean, that's something that does happen with recovery. And I think it's important for people in that situation to know that there's hope and that things can change and get better. Because I think that's a pretty painful and lonely place to be if you're if you're bottoming out in that situation. So yes, I would say definitely yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just going to say the healing process, I think, is just really one of recovery, and it's a lot of work. And I think oftentimes it involves dealing with trauma, one's own trauma, and doing a lot of deep emotional work to see how one got in that place, and then to really kind of live a healthy life of recovery from that point forward.
Yeah, I would add a couple things to that. Number one, almost anybody who's truly a sex addict has probably committed some sort of illegal sexual behavior, whether it's public sex or voyeurism or stumbling across illegal porn or a hands-on offense, or I mean, it's kind of part and parcel. Even if the addiction doesn't start out that way, it's going to escalate and take you places you never thought you were going to go. That said, I've done some writing with Dr. Rob on sex offending. There are definitely some categories. There are violent offenders. There are what we call dedicated child offenders whose only attraction is to children. Those groups are not very treatable. There are what we call situational child offenders. You know, it's not their primary attraction, but it's an attraction, and something comes up and they happen to stumble across it. And then there are the sex addicts whose behavior escalates into something they never thought they would do. We see these last two categories a lot. The internet has created a whole generation of child sex offenders with internet porn and access to people, you know, people who never would have done this 30 years ago because there was no access. Unfortunately, the legal system hasn't caught up to the fact that, you know, these are not bad people. These are not untreatable people. As a matter of fact, these are eminently treatable. The risk for recidivism is incredibly low for situational offenders and, you know, non-dedicated offenders and addicted offenders. It's an incredibly low. Once people get into treatment, work on their issues, there's tremendous hope, and there's a lot of healing. So yeah, I can't stress enough. Stay the course, and there's a lot of hope for you.
Great.
Next one here. Hi, I've been exposed to porn at a young age through my teen years and through most of my adult life. I regularly masturbated to porn. Once I got married, I pressed my wife for sex at excessive levels, 3 times per day sometimes. I began an affair at one time to try to have another sex partner. I have frequented strip clubs and have had lap dances. I've been able to stop my porn use in strip clubs, but still have a compulsive need to notice and objectify pretty much every woman that walks by. This happens even when my wife is with me, and sadly, I've noticed my wife's sister, and I have really hurt her with this behavior. I'm having trouble controlling this. Would this be a form of sex addiction? Yes.
Yeah, the short answer is I'd say yes. Yes. Yeah, so a couple things there. I think, as Scott mentioned, porn, the pervasiveness of porn right now in our society is really having all these consequences. And I think the exposure to porn at a young age is quite destructive in terms of the development of kind of a healthy sexuality and a healthy sense of a partner, and the predominance of kind of objectifying women at an early age and learning how to do that. And really the recovery process here is kind of unlearning how to do that objectification that comes so naturally there. I think sex is hard anyway, and I think porn has just really complicated it for vast numbers of, really a whole generation now. We're seeing this in other kinds of stuff unrelated to this question with porn-induced erectile dysfunction among young men and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, this kind of behavior, and it's just so distressing for a partner to be aware of that if they are, to sort of, first of all, if you're trying to have a conversation with someone too, and their eyes are kind of all over the place, and you're not connected, it's not attached there. But it's kind of disrespectful and hurtful, and people notice it, and the people you care about notice it. And so, yeah, so congratulations on cutting back on some of those behaviors. But I think there's a whole package of sex addiction behaviors here that I would encourage you to, if you're not already, to really get into a 12-step fellowship and start to address all of these behaviors, because these are learned. They can be unlearned. You can change your behaviors. We at Seeking Integrity, there's a morning check-in, and invariably in the group, someone will say, you know, just on the van ride from the house to the office, you know, they know it's Southern California, they know some attractive person on the street. And, you know, there are going to be people out there in the world that are attractive. You know, we can't not see them, but what we can do is control how we react to them and how we not objectify them. And one of the things we ask our guys to do is to think of them as someone's wife or daughter or sister, or, you know, that has needs and feelings, and just kind of humanify them to the greatest extent you can. But yeah, I mean, this behavior is definitely sex addiction behavior. And I would say, if you don't get a handle on it, it's probably going to lead to a recurrence of some of those other things that you've been put on the shelf for a while. So yeah, definitely, I'd reach out, get some help. I would try to get a CSAT, a certified sex addiction therapist, to help you with this. Sadly, what we found is that there's a lot of therapists out there who don't understand some of these behaviors, and either will make a moral judgment on you or say it's just the way men are, or God knows what they're going to say. But this is an issue. It's an addiction. And so you need to find somebody who understands that and can really help you with it, so you can move past this. You know, this is something that stems from unfortunate circumstances way back, and you know, you can change that and get past it.
Yeah, I want to go back to our first question about, you know, what sex addiction looks like and what it doesn't look like. This is what sex addiction looks like. Exposed to porn at a young age, which is the most common risk factor for sex and porn addiction, is early exposure to porn. And kids are looking at porn 9, 10, 11 years old now. 10 years from now, we're going to see a tsunami of sex addicts. Right. But, you know, masturbating to porn regularly, pressing your wife for sex 3 times a day, having an affair so you can have another sex partner, strip clubs, lap dances, you know, objectification. So let's run it through the criteria. Preoccupation to the point of obsession. Yeah. Loss of control. I have trouble controlling this. You see, it's right in the question. I have trouble controlling this. Means you've tried. You know, so yeah. And the third one, you know, consequences, clearly. You know, you're hurting your relationship. You're probably hurting your self-esteem. This is what sex addiction looks like. You know, this, you know, people think, oh, sex addiction, sign me up, sounds fun. Sex addiction is not fun. Sex addiction is no more fun than heroin addiction. It's miserable. It just ruins your life, and it ruins the life of the people around you. It hurts you, it hurts them. And we just do things in our addiction that we can't wrap our heads around because it's not us. But even though we're doing it, there are days when I look in the mirror and think, who was that person? You know I did that stuff, but really, that was me? That's what addiction does to us. So yeah. Yeah. And again, there is recovery. You know, it takes work, it takes effort. Objectification is a hard thing to do. There's a reading in the Sex Addicts Anonymous literature that says the lust of the mind may take years to drain away. And they're not kidding. It does, but we slowly do a little bit better. I had a rubber band around my wrist for like a year. I would just snap it every time I was objectifying somebody, just to try and get myself out of it. You know, and that's pretty common. So next question. Someone suggested that recovery from sex addiction doesn't really start until you've been sober for 90 days. Yikes. That seems super discouraging. How am I supposed to deal with all the uncomfortable emotions during those 90 days? After all, the uncomfortable emotions are the core of the problem. David?
Yeah, so when we talk about 90 days, often we're talking oftentimes about a sexual abstinence period, including masturbation, which allows the brain time to kind of reset and reboot from this very high level of kind of artificial stimulation. So, I mean, I don't like to sort of put a time frame on when recovery starts like that. I think recovery starts when you walk in your 12-step room and sit down and say, I'm a sex addict. To me, that's the beginning of recovery. Now, recovery is a long, hard path, but I think to say that you have to sit there and suffer for 90 days before you can qualify to be in recovery is just not useful. So I think, addiction is kind of a self-defining thing. I think we have to ultimately admit what we are. And I think when you do say those words, I'm a sex addict, I think that really starts a process. And I would consider yourself in recovery the moment you utter those words and really believe it. Now, will that instantly heal you? No, because this is a long process. And, we talked in this webinar before about how many years did it take us to get to this point, and it's going to take a while to come back. Fortunately, I don't think it takes as many years to walk out of the woods as it did to walk deep into it. But, it took a long time and a lot of rigorous training of our brains to get to this point. And so I think it's going to take a while to undo it. But I think it definitely comes in stages. But recovery starts when you say you're a sex addict and stop the behaviors, or at least start to stop the behaviors. Oftentimes it's not a clean break. People have lapses, they have slips. It does happen. I don't like to encourage it, but I don't want to shame it either because it's part of the process, and it does happen. But and that's all part of it. And I think if you trip up, you go back and look at what went wrong, what can you learn from it, and how can you apply that going forward? And you build. It's a building process of recovery and momentum, really. And in the meantime, there's skills. Early recovery to me is all about skills and learning how to ground yourself, how to calm yourself, how to control your feelings, how to express yourself, how to communicate, how to listen. And there's a lot of skills going on that really lay the groundwork. They're the skills that we need to kind of build our recovery. And so, there's different phases for sure, but I think it's unfair to say that recovery doesn't start till this point or that point. You may not feel the benefits of recovery for a while, because remember, addiction is all about how we cope with stuff that's unpleasant. And so if we take away all your coping skills, which is the addiction, you're going to start feeling feelings. Feelings bubble up. You may feel lonely or unworthy or sad, or God knows. We've talked on this webinar before about that too, all the feelings that come up. I had a lot of really grief kind of feelings for a couple of years. I thought I would never stop crying once it started. And that was my belief, by the way. I can't start crying because it'll never stop. And of course it did, but I had to get all that stuff out. And so it's a process. I would just be really gentle with yourself, surround yourself by supportive people, by loving people. And remember, the way we get through this is connection. We cannot do this alone. And we go through it with other people, and other people that get us and can be there for us when we have trouble being there for ourselves. And that's our job at Seeking Integrity too, is to create that container to make it safe for people to start that process. But really, they have to continue it when they go home and out into the world by replicating those connections and creating their own container for the work. But good for you. But I think, recovery starts when we can say from our heart that, yeah, I'm an addict and I need help. I'm powerless over this thing that's gotten me.
Yeah. By the way, ask us some questions. We've actually caught up with you guys. So type some more questions in for us. But I agree that, I don't know, you have to be sober for 90 days before no. The moment I said, I'm a sex addict and I need help, I was in recovery. If you look at the 12 steps, the short version of the first 3 steps of the 12 steps is, I have a problem, I need help, I think I'll accept help. That's what steps 1, 2, and 3 boil down to. And the minute I walked into therapy, and the minute I walked into a 12-step meeting, I was doing the first 3 steps. You know, I have a problem. I need help. I think I'll get some help. You know, and that's in recovery. So, okay, the follow-up to that previous question is, what do I do during the first 90 days when I'm struggling? Which is a very, very, very good question. I think hearing an answer will be useful for a lot of people.
Yeah, so those 90 days are really critical. And I think for me, I didn't, my goal was just I went to meetings. I went to work and I went to meetings. The only thing I had left, and this is my total denial system too, but I had my job, and I'd lost everybody in my life. I had no life at all, but I had my job because I needed a paycheck to pay for my addiction. And so that was my rationale. I can't be an addict. I go to work every day. You know, addicts don't go to work, they miss work. And so believe me, when I was at work, I wasn't very functional, but probably my head down on the desk most of the day, but I always showed up. But so I went to work in recovery, but I went to meetings, and I went to 2 and 3 meetings a day for years, probably, but certainly for the good year, I went to, you know, 2 and 3 meetings a day. So I just stuck close to program because I did not know what to do, but I knew that I couldn't do it on my own. And I knew that if I was in a meeting, I was safe for that hour. And if I went to coffee with people, I could buy myself another hour just to kind of sit there and be connected. And that's all I had to do, is to show up and be there. And when I had thoughts, I had to try to hang on to my willingness. I had to try to hang on to my belief that I was powerless. And I would have, you know, creeping thoughts come in and try to kind of pull me back. And in those cases, I would call people. So it was really about just connection. I was connected either sitting in the room, or I reluctantly got a few phone numbers because I was just painfully shy about stuff, and made myself go to coffee with people, and got a job actually before we were supposed to be able to do it, because I was at like 18 days sober. Saying I was making coffee for the meeting because my temporary sponsor said, you need to do this just to like, and it was a great way to meet people. So I did service, and that was it. And I didn't try to deal with my history of trauma, and I didn't try to deal with a lot of the bigger issues in my life, the mess with my life. I just lived for the day and to get to the next day. And gradually those days got together. And then finally I was able to kind of start making more sense of it. I moved out of that crisis management, I guess, into maybe more stability, where I started to look at some of those feelings and get some help with that. I got some professional help as well. But I think those first 90 days are all about riding the ride. You know, it's a tough ride. A lot of feelings come up. I think about, we want to just maybe jump in and find solutions. For me too, there was this frustrating acceptance that all these problems couldn't be solved overnight. There were things that I didn't know how it was going to turn out, but I was just going to have to trust that they would turn out and I would be okay. So there's a lot of that kind of deferring, just so I could focus on really just getting through the next 24 hours.
Yeah, you know, my mantra in my first year of recovery was just do the next right thing. You know, what's the next right thing? Brush my teeth. You know, okay, I'm done brushing my teeth. What's the next right thing? I'll make the bed. I'll make the bed. What's the next right thing? Feed the cat. Okay, I'll feed the cat. And that's how I got through the day. I mean, just literally one tiny little, because I couldn't think beyond one task at a time. I was so messed up. You know, and sometimes I would have to call somebody and say, I don't know what to do now. I don't have to be at work for 45 minutes. And they'd say, okay, well, go get some coffee. I don't drink coffee. Do it anyway. You know, okay, I'd go get some coffee. Because I don't like coffee. You know, and there's another follow-up here. He says he wakes up desperately wanting to get online, watch porn, and masturbate. That's the habit. You got to change. You got to change your routine. You've got to, you know, if you wake up at 6:30 every day, commit to a 7 a.m. meeting, and, you know, take a shower and go make coffee for the meeting, or just go straight from bed to the meeting and make the coffee. Take that commitment. You've got to change. You know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So you're going to have to change the routine. we talked about the circle plan earlier. Your outer circle should include some first thing in the morning things for you to do. Whether it's reading a daily inspiration book. So I'm partial to this one because I wrote it. Or calling your sponsor, or checking in with a friend, or walking the dog, or whatever. Just change that routine somehow, and fill your outer circle with stuff to combat your problem times, which sounds like it's first thing in the morning.
And I totally agree with that. And I would add accountability. And so you might want to say, get somebody who's going to expect a call from you at 6:30 or 7, where you can check in with them right away, before you get out of bed. So they're expecting your call. That kind of thing I found really helpful to know that people were waiting for me to show up for something, or that they were expecting my call, or that I was somehow accountable, because on my own, I would just blow it off and drop back into my addiction. And so, all those things, and change the patterns. And if you do that long enough, habits change. If you do that, and not very long, actually, what is it, Scott? I think they say 21 days or something of regular, you can kind of rewire a habit so that it's not going to be your first thought when you wake up in the morning in 3 short weeks. But yeah, I think just changing those routines and building an accountability is a really important piece.
And if you find somebody else who struggles in the morning, say, hey, let's call each other at 7 a.m. or whatever time it is that you both get up. And there's some accountability, and it will change your routine and his routine. So yeah. Okay, next question here. I can't find a sponsor. I have an online sponsor, but my therapist says it should be someone I can meet with. I assume that means in person. I feel stuck in doing my steps without a sponsor.
Okay, I'm not sure why you can't find a sponsor there. I tell people to at least get a temporary sponsor. Most of the meetings where I live, at the end of the meeting, they'll ask for a show of hands of people who are willing to be a temporary sponsor, and you just pick somebody. I think one of the traps I fell into personally was trying to find the perfect sponsor. And so I went too long for a while without having a sponsor, or really one I was committed to, because I was looking for the perfect one. And there's no perfect sponsor. And that sponsor is not a marriage either. If a sponsor doesn't work out, people change sponsors. But I would at least get a temporary sponsor, and maybe try to find a meeting where they're actually a show of hands. The other thing, at least where I live, many meetings have lists of people, telephone call lists, and there's usually some kind of designation if they're willing to be a temporary sponsor or not. So there may be more resources than you're connecting with at the meetings, but I would inquire about that. But I do agree with your therapist. It's important, I think, to have someone you can meet face-to-face with, because I know from trying to do therapy over online versus sitting with someone, there's a big difference in the level of communication that is exchanged between two people. If you're really sitting there talking to somebody, there's a lot more ability to communicate. So I do think it's a good idea, but I would just push a little bit farther about trying to hook up with at least a temporary sponsor.
Yeah, you said you feel stuck with the steps without a sponsor. I totally agree. You got to have a sponsor to properly work the steps. So get one. Okay, so we got time probably for one more question here. I was in an orphanage and foster care for the first year of my life. Apparently, I cried so much that I was not easily placed with a family. I was adopted by a mother who suffered abuse in her childhood, and she acted this out on her children as well. As I grew up, I was very ashamed about being adopted and repressed this from my thinking and rarely shared this detail with others. Can you talk about how this might influence my vulnerability to addictions and intimacy issues?
Wow. We have very few minutes left to talk about that. That's a really huge issue, and I'm sorry for those circumstances that you went through. There are some resources out there on some of the adult psychological manifestations of adoption. What we know is that it's not unusual to have attachment kinds of issues. And what I mean by attachment is our ability to connect and bond with and trust other people. And especially that first year of life is so critical. Babies to thrive need to be held and nurtured and have that human connection. And so I'm not surprised that there would be some problems later in life connecting and trusting and attaching to people. And oftentimes addiction goes with that as a way to deal with that discomfort. The good news there, again, is that these issues are fairly well understood by some mental health people that work in this area. And I would really encourage you to find someone who specializes in this, that can help guide you. I mean, it makes perfect sense that there would be some addictive acting out in this case, because we really, those first couple of years of life really establish long-term patterns in our ability to connect with people and trust people and be vulnerable and be intimate, and it's a whole range of things. And if you didn't get those early on as a kid, as an infant, there are ways to sort of learn those and practice that and gain those as adults. But that makes perfect sense to me. But I would really encourage you to find someone, a therapist, a mental health worker who can guide you through some of that, because those are some deep issues, and I would say traumatic issues that we have very effective trauma therapies that can help you with that.
Yeah, there's a ton of research into early life attachment or lack thereof usually, and how that impacts us later in life. And, you know, we're just more susceptible to physical illness, mental illness, addiction, everything, if we are not able to feel securely attached. I wish we could probably, this is probably an entire webinar.
Yeah.
And we should write this one down and revisit attachment later. But yeah, it's such a huge topic, and yeah. So we are out of time. David, you want to take us out with any kind of a recap, or?
Yeah, I mean, we started kind of with those setting boundaries with how we protect ourselves in recovery from people who may or may not be addicts, using substances and sex and drugs and things around us, and how we can take care of ourselves in that. And well, I think a lot of the questions tonight have been kind of feeling our way, like what's an addiction, what's not, and how do we take care of ourselves and set those boundaries. So I think it's been a good webinar, but I think it's really comes down to intention and really healthy boundaries and knowing knowing that we need to stay connected with people, healthy people around us.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We had a big group tonight, which was cool. We like that. And David will be away next week, but I'll be here with Karen Brond, who's our senior clinician at Seeking Integrity. She's great. And then David will be back with us in 2 weeks. So
Well, yeah.
See you soon. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.